Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar. It's called Indigenous Awareness 101. My name is Hannah Williamson and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar, and I just have a few housekeeping points I want to run through to make sure we can all participate and engage effectively today. So as participants, I want you to just check your audio settings. So all of our participants on the line are muted today, so please check that you can hear us correctly. If you're having any technical issues, please use the chat box and select question for staff, and my colleague Laurel is going to do everything she can to try and resolve your issue. Just one quick tip that I will share right now is that if you're having difficulties hearing us, you're not hearing any audio, please try leaving the call and joining again. Today's presentation is being recorded, so you'll be sent a copy of the recording after the session ends. You'll receive this by email, and the recording will also be available on the EcoCanada website. Questions are encouraged, and today's speaker, Brad, really encourages you to submit all of your questions, and we're going to have some dedicated time after the presentation ends where we'll run through those questions with you. But you can use, again, the chat box and select questions for staff to submit your questions. If we don't have time for all the questions we're going to get today, don't worry, we'll take those and send them to Brad afterwards and get you an answer offline. Finally, I just want to say that we are really interested in what you think and feel about our webinar series too. So you'll be sent a short survey just after the session ends. If you could take a couple of minutes and let us know what you thought about today's presentation, or if you have any suggestions or comments for future sessions. Today's webinar is brought to you by EcoCanada, and ECO is a steward for the Canadian environmental workforce across all sectors and industries in Canada. Not only do we work with professionals to train and certify, we also carry out in-house research to understand the labour market trends in Canada. And we use that insight and that research to help tailor our programs to the professionals who are working in Canada's environmental sector. And everything that we do here at EcoCanada is really tailored towards sustainable economic growth and ensuring that environmental care and best practice is paramount in everything that we do. Now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to today's guest speaker. I'm so happy that Brad can join us today. Brad is one of my lovely colleagues here at EcoCanada, and he's our Indigenous and Communities Relations Specialist. Brad is a proud member of the Saddle Lake First Nation and has 15 years experience working in both stakeholder and Indigenous relations across lots of different sectors like not-for-profit and oil and gas. So Brad, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you and take us through today's presentation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Hannah. One of the first things that we're going to talk about right off the bat is I am from Saddle Lake. I am a status Indian. I'm bringing this Indigenous awareness presentation with an Indigenous perspective. One of the things that I do at every training session, every meeting, is that I like to start by doing an opening prayer, a blessing. So thank you for giving me that time to do that. And with that, I'd like to elaborate just a little bit more about myself. I am from Saddle Lake First Nation. I'm married down here into Treaty 7 territory. My wife's from Siksika. I'm adopted out here in Sutuna and probably about 30 other different reserves throughout North America. I joined EcoCanada last year. I left the oil and gas sector to move it and transition into the environment. It's very meaningful to me. I really feel the environment, especially environmental careers, education and awareness, is the key to moving forward, especially our Canadian economy. So on today's Indigenous 101 session, this session was put together with just the basic high-level understanding of some of the Indigenous awareness for people that might not have engaged any Indigenous communities or Indigenous people, or wanting to learn more, or wanting to learn about the culture and our way of life. So what we're going to cover today at a high level is we're going to do a traditional land acknowledgement. We're going to talk some Indigenous terminology. We'll talk about what elders are, traditional knowledge keepers, protocols. We'll discuss the the First or Indigenous groups, the Métis, the Inuit, the First Nations, and the challenges that each one of us face. And then I'll talk a little bit more about Eco Canada, and then we'll have a question period. So first off, we always do a traditional land acknowledgement. And this is what we put together for Eco Canada. Our head office is here in Mohkinstsis, or what we call Calgary, downtown. Eco Canada's commitment to reconciliation starts with acknowledging our honor to work, live, play within the Treaty 7 territory. Eco Canada acknowledges the traditional territories and the oral practices of the Niitsitapi, or the Blackfoot Nations, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai. We also acknowledge the Tsuut'ina and the Ehe Nakota, which includes the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and the Wesley First Nations. In addition to the city of Calgary is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region Zone 3. Why do we do a traditional land acknowledgement? It's out of respect. This has been going on from time immemorial. It's the same as if we were going into your house or you were going into someone's house. You just acknowledge, thank you for having us into your home. You have a beautiful home. Thank you for allowing us to come and share this. And that's why we do a traditional land acknowledgement. That reconciliation effort is just that part of it that ties it in to where we are today in Canada. But that's why we do a traditional land acknowledgement. Now, Indigenous peoples at a high level, we're non-homogeneous. Our protocols differ vastly from one Indigenous group to another, from one community to another. And coming to understand the cultures, the practice of protocols, that's a lifelong journey. You are not going to understand everything within a 1-hour webinar. What I tell people, especially within our culture, it's a lifelong journey. What you put into your culture is what you're going to get out of it. You're not going to learn everything overnight. Traditional Indigenous knowledge, or TK knowledge, and traditional resources have been managed by Indigenous communities since time immemorial. Time immemorial is a phrase meaning time extending beyond the reach of memory, record, or tradition, indefinitely ancient, ancient beyond memory or record. Indigenous peoples have many stories that carry knowledge from ancestors into present day. We pass a lot of our history or traditions down orally. Our oral history can be defined as recording, preservations, interpretations of historical information based on the personal experiences and opinions of the speaker. Oral history often takes the form of eyewitness evidence about past events, but can include folklore, legends or the origin legends, myths, songs, stories passed down over the years by words of mouth. And those songs that you just heard me sing, that was one of our prayer songs. My late brother made that song. We went to ceremony with that song, and those spirits told us how much they liked that song, and that became our Chiushpai drum song, our prayer song. And we were told whenever we're having difficulties in life to use that song. And I use that song today to honor my late brother and for the blessings for today. But that was passed down from my brother to us. This is just a recent, he made that song 15 years ago, but that song now will be passed down for generations. So that's an introduction to time immemorial. I wanted to do some quick facts about Indigenous people. We're the fastest growing demographic in Canada. In 2016, there was 1,673,000 Aboriginal people in Canada, making up almost 5% of the population. 58.4 were First Nation, 35% were Métis, and almost 4% were Inuit. Over 400,000 youth will be entering the labor market in the next 15 years. That's 2 times faster than any other demographic. 69% graduate from high school compared to 77% of non-Indigenous people in 2019. In Canada, there are more than 70 Indigenous languages across 12 language groups. And in 2016, an estimated 260,000 Indigenous people spoke their language. It was 1 in 3 elders and 1 in 10 children speak their languages. And there are more than 600 First Nations and bands reserves across Canada on 3,100 reserves. So in 1992, the government of Canada patriated the Canadian Constitution, and in doing so, they formally entrenched the Aboriginal treaty rights in the Supreme Law of Canada. In Section 35, neither conforms nor creates absolute rights. It does confirm existing Aboriginal treaty rights that have not been extinguished or surrendered, or legislation before 1982. On the other hand, Aboriginal rights and treaty rights existing of the Proclamation of the Constitution Act in 1982 now receive significant legal protection under Section 35. Existing Aboriginal land rights can no longer be extinguished without the consent of the Aboriginal peoples holding the interest in their lands. So basically, this is where the Canadian Constitution has entrenched our acknowledgement of Indigenous people, our rights here within the Canadian Constitution. Now, when we start talking Indigenous, when we start talking Aboriginal, I get so many questions asked about terminology. What is the correct terminology? And the Inuit is a term that refers to the specific groups of the people generally living in the far north. They are called Inuit or Inuk. Now, the Métis people are referred as Métis. A lot of people had that old terminology of half-breeds, and this is where they come from, the mixed race. And we'll go into the depths of Métis people in a few more slides here. But Métis is the correct terminology for Métis people. Now, when we start talking First Nation people, we start talking about Indian. And in Canada, status Indian remains a legal designation or terminology due to that Indian Act. Native was used because it was born from. Although if you use that Native as that context, born from, it is okay to utilize it. Most people find it outdated. It was formerly a collective term referring to Indians, but a lot of people find it offensive and rarely used in respectful conversations. It is replaced with Indigenous. Aboriginal people the Aboriginal terminology first moved into popularity as a collective noun for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and was widely adopted when the distinction was made, just what we talked about in the Canadian Constitution of 1982. Aboriginal covers the Métis, the Inuit, and the First Nation. Where we are today, Indigenous comes from the Latin word meaning indigena, it means sprung from the land, native. So therefore, using Indigenous over Aboriginal reinforces land claims and encourages territory acknowledgements, a practice which links Indigenous peoples to their land and respects their land claims over it. It also aligns with UNDRIP and aligns us globally. Now, elders, this is another question I always get asked about. Define an elder? An elder is not defined by age or gender, but by rather, elders are recognized because they have earned the respect of their community through wisdom, harmony, and a balance of their actions and their teachings. One of the most deepest traits for elders is that they are our wisdom holders, our spiritual knowledge holders. They strive to lead by example, by living their lives according to deeply ingrained principles, values, and the teachings that they were taught. Their duties may include opening prayers, smudges, sweats, ceremonies, sun dances, fasting, protocols for meetings, at events, working with our youth, doing our counseling, sweetgrass ceremonies, even for negotiations. So our aspects of our elders are wide range of services, but they are our wisdom holders. They are our teachers. They are our leaders. They're our community uh, knowledge holders. So, and just so you know, there are 4 sacred plants of tobacco, sweetgrass, sage, and cedar. A gift of one of these sacred plants is seen as a recognition of wisdom an elder can share. In Inuit culture, tobacco is not used ceremoniously or ceremonially. Having said that, if you don't know what to call someone, if you don't know a protocol, if you're building those relationships, ask. Do not assume. Always ask that individual what they would like to be referred as, how they refer themselves as, or what's the protocol to engage elders. That may vary from community to community, or from different, from Cree to Sioux to Blackfoot. We all have our different protocols. We all have to respect all those. And if you're not sure how to engage, ask that person locally. So this is a big thing that I really like. I love promoting it. I just don't know who said it, so I apologize for not knowing who said this, but it's nothing about us without us. Today, if you are doing business in Canada of any kind, you are probably doing business with Indigenous people, and we'll get to that because of our the territory, the land maps that I'll go through. You'll see almost every inch of Canada is on our traditional lands. So if you're doing business in Canada, you're doing business with Indigenous people. It's how we do the business now. It might not be as usual how it used to be. Now it could be incorporated through the ESGs, the environmental social governance. Maybe it's through equity participation. Maybe it's through mutual beneficial agreements or IBAs. All we know, and this is just my opinion, is that our communities are tired of tokenism. We want meaningful relationships. So, the environmental social governance is a criteria of a set of standards for a company's operation that socially concise investors use to screen potential investments. Environmental criteria consider how a company performs as a steward of nature. Socioeconomics, also known as the social economy, is the social sciences that studies how economic activity affects and is shaped by social processes. In general, it analyzes how modern societies progress, stagnate, or regress because of their local and regional economies or a global economy. And this is just how we do business today. Maybe it has to be ingrained into our environmental standards. Maybe it has to be done incorporate it into our social standards, into our governance standards. It's just the right thing to do. So I did this slide just to introduce some ceremonial or meeting protocols. I often get asked about behavior traits and how to engage a community. So the first things I wanted to talk about really is the attire. If you were to meet or go to a ceremony, there are certain attires that our people wear. And yes, we're not expecting everyone to come wearing moccasins or in our traditional attire, but a woman participating in the ceremonial would wear our traditional ribbon skirts. Us men, we would dress respectfully. Business shirt, business casual is what I like to say. We're more worried about the messaging of the meeting or the introduction, about that relationship. We're more, that meaningful purpose is what we're interested in. We're not worried how people look. All we would say is dress respectfully. Again, if you were to go have a meeting with another industry or a community, you might want to offer that tobacco or gift giving for the elder services. Like I said, we normally start with an opening prayer just to give thanks for bringing us all together so that the meeting possibly may go in a positive way, that everyone's emotions are in check or everyone's on the same page, things like that. Some of the elders might incorporate their smudging, and smudging is our way of cleansing and praying every morning, every day. We could use either sweetgrass, sage, the fungus that we use, but it's another form of our prayer. And again, right after the smudging, we go into that traditional land acknowledgement. And as I mentioned before, it's really more that sign of respect of thanking them for having us or meeting us in their territory or in their home. So, and then normally we do introductions. And in Western Canada here, we do a lot of clockwise introductions, but down east, they do a lot of counterclockwise. Again, if you're going to meet with someone across a different region, ask. They might have a different way. How to shake hands. Long ago, people would just come in and they would try to be assertive and they would be real aggressive and dominant, overbearing. And what I like to say is that your two lives coming together, two people uniting, be respectful. You don't want to do a limp noodle handshake and you don't want to be overbearing. Just be respectful, especially with our elders. So many people within business want to reach out and they think our elders are 20, 30 years old and we could hurt our elders. So again, know who you're handshaking with. Just be respectful. Now, eye contact. If you've noticed right now, I don't do a lot of eye contact, and that is one of the things that we got from residential school. It's not that we're trying to be disrespectful if we're not looking at you in the face or eye to eye. It's just that that's how some of us were taught, either being humble or that colonialism entering our lifestyle, or that's how it's affected our lifestyle. So some of us don't look into the eyes, and don't take it as a sign of disrespect. Again, we'll talk about residential schools and the impacts it's had. But when you go to shake hands, if some people look into your eyes, that's fine. But if you're wondering why if people don't look into your eyes while you're shaking hands, that could be a reason why. I know that's the reason why I don't do it. And I should say this, I should have said this at the very start. These are only my opinions and beliefs and teachings that have been shared with me throughout Canada, throughout my Indigenous network or my community, my families. But with Indigenous people, relationships are fundamental. Be open, honest about sharing details about yourself. Just what we were talking about quickly about doing business, about no more tokenism. Well, we don't, if you're not going to be honest and have wanting a sincere relationship with Indigenous people, we don't need that tokenism. We want to have an honest relationship. And once you open up yourself to that vulnerability of having that relationship, we get to a point of almost getting to a joking relationship. You know you're good and in with Indigenous people when we get to that joking, teasing relationship. So, and know your audience, who you're talking to. I want to thank Giselle Satorsky at Imperial who helped put this together. I know this. I used to work at Imperial. I know I really wanted to customize, make this my own, but I really liked this slide when we did our last Indigenous 101 presentation together. We really put this for all the engineering people or the if you've done that personality trait, the red personalities, this is what this slide is for. Our elders don't know acronyms like we work in industry. Between environmental industry, between government, between oil and gas, whatever it may be, we have a book of acronyms that go on and on and on, and we can't expect our elders to know all these acronyms. So know your audience, who you're talking to. If you go for a meeting, use simple words, use positive body languages, be cultural sensitive and appropriate. Check for that understanding, seek participation, effective questioning, summarize. Just what I'm trying to do right now is connect with the audience. But the number one thing is be an effective listener. If you're going out to our communities, really listen. So a little about Eco Canada. We've been engaging Indigenous communities since 1992, and these are just some of the communities that we have engaged with. We, as Indigenous people, we take a holistic point of view, which is an important aspect of supporting our people. You must show up to have a relationship. It's not just a one and done. If you want to have a relationship with Indigenous people, you must be there over a period of time. I find for me, 99% of building that relationship is showing up. You have to show up. And that will prove that sincerity to build that trust with Indigenous communities, with Indigenous people, is that you're sincere. So I want to get into specifically right now the Métis Nation of Canada. This is one of the first of the three Indigenous groups that we'll be talking about. And the Métis Nation, or Métis people, are a mixed race of people. European Indigenous ancestry meaning either First Nation or Inuit Métis descent. Typically descendants of First Nation women, mainly Cree, Nakota, and Ojibwe. The Métis are a distinct Indigenous people with both First Nations and Euro settler ancestry. They arose out of the fur trade in the late 1700s in the interior of West Central North America as the children of First Nations women and Euro-Canadian European fur trade employees, forming the Métis Nation. These mixed heritage children developed families and communities that had their own unique culture, traditions, languages, and their specific language is called mischief. And some people pronounce it mischief. There's different ways, but they do have their own distinct language. Most of it is a blend of Cree, English, and French. Now, the National Métis or Métis Nation of Canada defines Métis as a person who self-identifies as Métis and is distinct from other Indigenous peoples, is of historic Métis Nation ancestry, and is accepted by the Métis Nation. The Métis are a distinct Indigenous people with their own unique history and culture, language, and territories that includes the waterways that surround the Great Lakes and spans known what we call the historic Northwest. On December 2018, Métis Nations Council's Homeland Boundaries map came out. This is what you see right there. It's very controversial. I'm not going to get into a lot of it right now, but for First Nation people, obviously, if we were born of or from this land, if we were here first prior and the Métis came, obviously they feel they have their traditional lands. We feel as First Nation people that's infringing upon our traditional lands. So that's why it's controversial. And that's one of the challenges Métis people face. Métis culture, they have their own distinct sash. It's all hand webbed, finger weaving. There's 8 specific Métis settlements, which we'll talk to in a moment. It's unique to Alberta. It's a title of land. It's non-status. They have their own traditional knowledge holders. It encompasses all aspects of the Métis way of life, biological, ecological, social, cultural, spiritual. And their traditional knowledge is part of that collective memory as a community and is passed orally from one generation to the next, just like the First Nation people. And these are those 8 Métis land-based settlements. Alberta has the largest Métis population in Canada with over 114,000 Métis people living in the province. Approximately 5,000 people live on these 8 Métis settlements, which covers a land base of 1.25 million acres. For those that live up north of Edmonton, this is called Métis Crossing. The Alberta government helped get this started a few years ago. It is open now. If you want an authentic and traditional Métis cultural experience, I encourage you, please go to the Métis Cultural Center. I do know that the Métis Association of Alberta, Audrey, has requested that all meetings, engagements, they're really looking for industry to support their Métis Cultural Center. And this is just a little bit of a Métis historical timeline. Hudson Bay came in 1600s. I'm not going to go through all of these. These are going to be within that recorded presentation, so you can read through them at your own pace. But there are some interesting notes. It's obviously one of the most important ones. In 2013 was a Daniels case that gave the federal ruling that Métis are non-status but are Indians. Now, some of the challenges the Métis people face, they feel that they're the forgotten people, just what I was saying. they have a hard time trying to get their own self-determination, self-governance, especially for land claims, especially as a First Nation person. If we were here first as First Nation, Métis people coming after, they have a hard time trying to distinguish those land claims. How do you do that? And that's a challenge that they face. Poverty, inequality for economic, racial, gender, and health, healthcare, economic development, housing in those settlements on and off those communities is a huge challenge. The quality of education, so that there be the same standard for everyone for education. They have a huge challenge with that. Employment barriers. All we're asking for opportunities for employment. And of course, racism. And one of the biggest challenges that Métis people face is a loss of culture. How do they protect their language? How do they protect that identity? So that cultural preservation. And that goes for all Indigenous people. So now I'd like to talk quickly about the Inuit. Inuktitut is for the people. They are a distinct Indigenous people, the majority of whom inhabit the northern regions of Canada. An Inuit person is known as a Nook, and the Inuit homeland is known as the Inuit Nunangut, which refers to the land, water, and ice that's contained in that Arctic region. The Inuit people were unable to farm and grow their own food in their harsh desert of their tundra. They mostly lived off the land, hunting animals, meat, food. They used harpoons to hunt seals, walruses, bowhead whales. They also ate fish and foraged for wild berries. There are 8 main Inuit ethnic groups of the Inuit people. Out of respect, I am not Inuit. I do not want to try pronunciate all of these groups, but just know and understand there are 8 ethnic groups in their region. They have 5 main language dialects in Canada. And again, I just don't want to mispronunciate, being respectful. So just understand that there are 5 main dialects in Canada for the Inuit people. Now, harsh climates and stark landscapes. That was a huge challenge for the Inuit peoples. How do they get around? Their transportation, they use dog sleds, kayaks, umiaks, which were the larger boats. They had a nomadic way of life because they had to go where the food sources were. There were certain seasons, locations that they would go for certain types or certain times throughout the year. But again, the Inuit culture and way of life is very distinct. They have their own storytelling, dancing, family, wildlife, spirituality. They also feel that they were the caretakers of the land. And for the Inuit people, water is the most sacred thing. And again, here's a quick Inuit historical timeline. Excuse me. The interesting note here, there was just recently the talk started way back in the 30s, 40s, went to the 60s and 70s, but it was really in 1999, 2000s is when Nunavut officially separated from the Northwest Territories, and we have the new mapping of the regions today. So now for Inuit challenges, one of the biggest challenges that the Inuit people face is climate change. I heard stories of runways melting underneath the lands. They were getting almost like a hole in it, that sunk sinkholes, because the permafrost was melting. And just what I said about Métis people, this goes for all Indigenous people. But how do they protect that culture? How do they preserve our culture, our way of life, especially our languages? Now, Inuit culture grows from the land, and due to the unpredictable weather forcing the communities to adjust in their way of life or their traditions or how they've done things. So they have their social and economic hardship. They challenge self-determination, governance, poverty, inequality, again, for economic, racial, gender, healthcare, especially in the North, is a huge challenge. Again, employment barriers and opportunities, racism, stereotypes. Housing is a huge issue to the North. So, access to food. Obviously, due to their tundra and their landscape, growing food is a huge challenge. Getting food shipped up there to the northern stores is quite costly. So the cost of living, or even just access to food, is a challenge for them. Obviously, with the climate, the safety, the infrastructure, transportation, these are just all some of the challenges the Inuit people face. Now, as First Nation people, I could talk to this prevalently because I am First Nation. We have our own culture. It's a very strong culture. It's a power of prayer. We feel like the Inuit, like the Métis, that they are the caretakers of the land. Our culture's land-based. We have a unique relationship with the Mother Earth. We do lack trust with the government, industry, and public, other Indigenous people even. Just what I was saying, we're non-homogeneous, we're very diverse, and we're also treaty people. And these are just some examples of Indigenous people who we are. Carrie Price, Roberta Jameson, Chris Wilson with Birch Mountain. We're diverse. Now, First Nations are the predominant Indigenous people in Canada. There are over 634 recognized First Nations governments banned across Canada from time immemorial. And there's that phrase again. This is that phrase meaning it's beyond the living memory of our people and is often used to describe the historical framework from which our people have existed. Now, our traditional knowledge is that we're an oral culture compared to a written culture. If we smoke our pipe, that's our contract, that's our ceremony, compared to a written culture where you have to sign on that dotted line. We have our elders and traditional knowledge keepers. And just what I was saying, that elders is that term refers to someone who has attained a high degree of understanding of First Nation, Métis, Inuit history, of traditional teachings, ceremonies, healing practices. We look at time as non-linear. We follow a moon cycle and land-based timeline. And our time orientation is of the present. Yes, we need to understand and respect, learn the history. We need to think about the future. But how we think is right now. And I'm here presenting this course to you right now at this moment. So we believe in that pipe, that picture of that lady in the middle there holding that pipe is the Mokpiaskawi, or the White Buffalo Cap woman. She's the one who brought us the pipe. We have our sacred rites that go with that pipe. We're non-materialistic people. Our most important thing is life. Respect life. And that's the life of Mother Earth, life of our winged ones, our four-legged, our human race. That pipe, I believe, and this is my teaching, that pipe there, if you look at it, there's a red bowl on that pipe. That I'll give you a quick teaching of that pipe. That red bowl is red because it signifies, represents everything that bleeds red. There's no one higher, there's no one lower. We're all equal. We're the same. We belong to that human race. It represents that man or that woman, and that stem represents that man. And when you join those two together, you join that universe. You're creating that universe. But to us, what I was getting into is life is the most important thing. Now, there are two types of First Nation people. There's status Indian people and there's non-status Indian people. And if you look at the top left corner, you see the status cards. There's actually a barcode put to it. We are the only people in the entire world that have a barcode associated with our registration. A status Indian is any First Nation individual of an Indigenous Canadian people who is registered as Indian under the Federal Indian Act and is registered with the band. And the non-status Indian is the individual whom, for whatever reason, is not registered with the federal government and or is not registered to a band which has signed a treaty with the Crown. So on this card, there's actual dates on here, and we have to renew this card every 10 years. I didn't know I expired or stopped being a First Nation people after 10 years. A lot of us people look at this card as another form of assimilation and how the government was tracking us. Yeah, I wanted to quickly read this, right? This is why many of us view the status Indian as a assimilation tool, a mechanism for the Canadian government to eventually legislate out the Indian identity. The Canadian government has historically acknowledged its unique relationship with and hence the obligation to First Nations, and therefore the government created the definition of Indian in order to administer services and resources over the appropriate people, namely Indigenous peoples. However, in using legislation to determine who qualifies as Indian status and the rights conferred with that status, some have argued that it creates a conflict of interest. For example, some may argue that it's the government's interest to reduce the numbers of eligible Indians and therefore ease the associated government responsibilities and expenditures. To legislate out the Indian status would ultimately absolve themselves from these obligations. So here's our First Nation historic timeline. Again, I'm not going to go through every one, but the one I will always bring up is the one in 2016, the Murdered Missing Women Indigenous Group, Murdered Missing Indigenous Women's Group. I apologize for messing that up. I'm so sorry. I should know that. But there were 506 cases that were identified across 71 selected urban cities in 2016. 128 cases were of missing Indigenous women. 280 cases were the murdered Indigenous women. So now we're going to get into a little bit of the history part. I'm just checking the timeline. I've only got 10 minutes left. So Doctrine of Discovery, Terra Nullius. Indigenous people refer to this as a domination code. Terra Nullius is a legal term used to describe the belief that lands occupied by Christians are empty and therefore open to appropriation and colonialization. In effect, terra nullius ignores the complex and diverse ways of life of Indigenous peoples that establish their rights to the land. And now we'll talk about the Indian Act real quick. In the Indian Act of 1876 for First Nations, they put path systems in place. It was illegal to gather in groups of more. They stopped all of our ceremonial practices. It was illegal to do that. It was a crime for us to speak our languages. We weren't able to speak our languages. To me, this is the most racist piece of paper that the Canadian government put out. Now, Canada is experiencing an adjustment with our Indigenous peoples in the communities. The Indian Act is the principal statute through which the federal government administers Indian status, local First Nation governments, and the management of the reserves, lands, and communal monies. The Indian Act pertains only to First Nation peoples, not the Métis or the Inuit. I could go into depth, so much depth on the Indian Act. Again, I just wanted to express my opinion. This is by far the most racist piece of legislation material that the Canadian government put out. The Canada residential school system. Residential schools were the Indigenous children, for Indigenous children started in the 1880s. The last one actually closed not long ago in 1996, but it was with the explicit goal of isolation from the families and westernize the children, so policy of assimilation. Sir John A. Macdonald said, and I quote, "When school is on the reserve, the child lives with his parents, who are savages, and through he may learn, read, and write. His habits in the training mode or thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read, write. It has been strongly impressed upon myself as the head of the department that the Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. And the only way to do that is to put them in centralized training industrial schools where they may acquire the habits and modes of the thought of a white man." Again, we could go into so much detail, fallout, the intergenerational trauma. We could talk to residential schools so much in depth. For those who have children, imagine your children being taken away out of your home right now. For a community, imagine a community with no children, with all the parents hurting, grieving for the loss of their children, their families, their homes ripped apart. I've got my recollection, my aunt being raped every Friday night at the barn with the orgy with the ministers. She took the rapings to protect my mom. She passed away from all those rapings. But we all have our residential school experiences. But the Canadian government didn't learn through the residential schools. They did it again in the 60s. 60 Scoops was coined by Patrick Johnson, and it was a report on the Native children in the child welfare system. It refers to the mass removal of Aboriginal children from their families into their child welfare system. So again, they took the homes, or they took the children out of the homes, broke up the families. It's horrific. There's actually a legal class action suit that's in process right now. And although the government began phasing this compulsory residential schools out in the 50s and 60s, this is where this stepped in to replace the residential schools. So the Canadian government didn't do it once, but they did it again in the 60s. Now, I've got a few minutes left. Truth Reconciliation. The Honorable Justice Murray, Dr. Marie Sinclair, and Honorable Chief Wilton Littlechild. They were the three main commissioners that sat on the Truth Reconciliation. They were the ones who brought out all of this to light when they talked, and they created 94 calls to action. They adopted the United Nations Declaration of Rights on Indigenous People. And the whole goal was to guide and inspire Indigenous peoples, Canadians, and the world in a process of renewed relationships and reconciliation. I don't like the word reconciliation. It means, to me, it means that we've done something wrong and we did nothing wrong. But what I like is the truth. There's truth ceremonies, and these are the truths. As horrific as they are, this is the reality. And once we understand, respect those truths, then we could honestly move forward together in a positive way. And call to action number 92, the business and reconciliation. I'm going to focus on the third one. It is to provide education and management staff on history of the Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and the Aboriginal Crown relation. This will require skill-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, and human rights and anti-racism. And this is why we're here today. Now, Indigenous and treaty rights, the rights of Indigenous people are entrenched in Canadian law, as we were talking earlier about the Canadian Constitution being repatriated in 1982, but it was first acknowledged and entrenched in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. We had a nation-to-nation friendship treaties, equal citizenship, and then the historic treaties came in from 1764 to 1921. But within these numbered treaties, the rights are not well defined. Interpretation of these treaties remain controversial. What was written, what was spoken in English, what was said and promised, what was understood. If English was not our first language, if we had our own languages, would we truly understand what was on that paper when we signed it, or our elders, our grandfathers, our relations way back when, would they have signed it? So if I came to you right now and I wanted to ask you to sign the treaty, and I put it all in Cree, and I said this, would you have a clear understanding of what a treaty I was going to make with you? I could say I was going to take your land, your house, I'll relocate you to a different place. Would you sign that? Would you have a clear understanding? So that's why there's a lot of, right here, that's why you're saying that interpretation remains controversial to this day. Now, Indigenous rights title consultation, practice our Indigenous rights, practices our traditions and customs that is unique to our culture and way of life. Now, in treaty rights, our practices, tradition, customs outlined explicitly in the formal treaties with the Crown. Indigenous titles is Indigenous property, right to land, rights to use land for economic benefit. Because the land is owned by the Crown, they can infringe upon that. Duty to consult. If any of these rights are infringed upon, this is where the duty to consult comes in place. Crown must consult with affected Indigenous groups prior to the government action, and that lies solely with the Crown. So I'm just going to race through. I know I'm a bit over time here. I just wanted to quickly talk about the reserved traditional treaty lands. Reserve lands are held by the Crown as a tract of land set aside under the Indian Act. Traditional lands span that. It refers to the area where our nation has occupied and used for many generations, long before these reserve borders were imposed by the Indian Act. They're typically larger than the reserve, no ownership of the resources. Treaty lands were specifically outlined and identified by the treaties. And that's where it comes in. If you look at this map with all those dots, those are all those reserves across Canada. And that's where I say, if you look at our traditional lands, almost every inch of Canada is our traditional land base. And that's where I say, if you're doing business in Canada, you're doing business with Indigenous people. Nothing about us without us. Now, all those reserves in Canada will fit into 38% of the Navajo Nation's reserve. As you can see, the reserves in the States do not have a lot of reserves, but they're huge. Indigenous differences within Canada, we're allies with the Crown. We have small reserves. Our treaty rights extend past our borders. We're constitutionally protected, but our chief and councils, we have limited band council powers. In the Northwest Territories, there are few reserves. There's no ceded lands. Treaty 11 exists up in Northwest Territories. Similar to Quebec and East Coast, they were all peace and friendship treaties. In BC, there's no number treaties, and that's why, because when they started off in the east going to the west in the 1800s, they ran into a little thing called the Rocky Mountains, and that's why all the treaties over there are modern day treaties, and there's a lot of uncertainty over land. And in the States, we're viewed as a conquered race. They have vast reserves, but they have complete certainty over their lands. They have complete autonomy over their land base on the reserves, but the minute you step off that reserve, you're considered a United States citizen. So that's the differences between Canada and USA. I just wanted to quickly touch base here. If this is called Just Get Over It video or Justice for Aboriginal Peoples, we'll send you out the link to this video after the webinar. But what I have said is this reinforced here by a different group of people down east, and it just summarizes the whole Aboriginal awareness video. And I think it's great, especially to hear from our diverse people. So now, our First Nation challenges: poverty, inequality, access to clean drinking water, racism, 60 scoop, the residential school fallout, so the intergenerational trauma, access to cultural support, Indian Act. These are just some of the First Nation challenges that we face. Our drinking water advisories on reserves. So here at Eco Canada, one of the first things I did when I came into the company is that I put together an Indigenous Relations Policy Mission Statement. And Eco Canada's relationship with Indigenous people is founded on respect. Respect for their distinct cultures, history, unique relationship to their land, and their legal status of Indigenous peoples. Eco Canada is committed to collaborating with Indigenous peoples and their communities to build a long-term and mutual beneficial relationships based on the values of honesty, inclusion, and respect. I got that policy based upon these following guideline principles. Eco Canada acknowledges that the treaty rights of Indigenous people in Canada are affirmed, recognized, and protected by the Canadian Constitution. Eco Canada acknowledges the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, and are committed to working with Indigenous peoples within the Canadian legal and constitutional framework. Eco Canada acknowledges and recognizes the diversity of Indigenous peoples in Canada and are committed to interacting with an Indigenous community in a way that respects our culture, customs, and history. Eco Canada acknowledges and respects that each Indigenous community has its own distinct and unique connection to the land and environment. and Eco-Canada appreciates the importance of learning from and respecting the cultures in which we operate. And I base those upon our 4 pillars, and that's through engagement, people and culture, community investment, and project participation. And as I was saying, this whole Indigenous Awareness program that we created was just to give a high-level overview of just some of the challenges we face, some of our perspectives, culturally, spiritually. But I really hope that for those that may have had their first time interacting or getting to know Indigenous people, or if they're wanting to engage Indigenous people in communities or businesses, how to engage them, I hope this is really beneficial for you. I do want to invite you on. I would, first of all, like to thank you for joining me today, and please join me again on October 28th for my next webinar on Indigenous cultural sensitivity training, and then again on November 18th when we discuss Indigenous barriers to employment. And if you have any ideas or topics that you'd like brought forward, please feel free to contact Hannah or myself. My contact information is right here. If anyone is still around or would like to ask any questions right now, please feel free. Or if you want to email Hannah or myself, we'll get those answers to you best we can. But thank you. Hi, Miigwech.
I think it's muted right now for you.
Lovely. Apologies, everyone. I was just thanking Brad for his time today and his presentation. It's a real honor and privilege to have Brad speak and share his personal experiences and his knowledge with us all. And as a newcomer to Canada with zero traditional knowledge and knowledge about Indigenous peoples, it's a great overview for me to kind of help me start my learning about Indigenous peoples in Canada. And we do have some questions. I know we've gone over slightly, so if you do have to leave, please don't worry, and we can send you the recording afterwards. But I'm gonna hand over to Laurel, who's going to take us through some of the questions that we have so far.
All right, thank you so much. So our first question here, Brad, is there a respectful way of asking Indigenous peoples which peoples they belong to or where their people are from?
Definitely. Whoever, if it's a community member, if it's a leadership, if you're going through their chief and council, come right out and ask. Be that direct. I would like to learn more about your people, where you come from, your history, your culture, your language, how you identify yourself. Engage them. And once you get to, this is what I was saying, if you open yourself up to that level of vulnerability to build that relationship, you would go there. If that person is Indigenous and you're talking directly, especially an elder, offer either a cigarette, a can of tobacco, a pouch of tobacco, some tobacco offering of some kind. We do that. You clearly express what you're giving that for. So if you were to give me a pouch of tobacco, please tell me, or please accept this tobacco and tell me how you refer yourself or what type of Indian you are or Indigenous person you are, and please share with me your history. That tobacco giving is for that specific reason. Anytime we engage our elders or our leadership, our chief and councils, we provide that tobacco because we're sharing knowledge. And it's not just one way of sharing knowledge, it's two-way. It's reciprocated. But once that elder or that community member takes and that tobacco offering, they're obligated to provide you those teachings. So I would go out personally with some tobacco and engage that community or that individual.
Wonderful. So our next question here says, I think many of us have trouble understanding the relationship between elders and band councils and the authority each of them have over decisions made on behalf of the band. Can you please talk about this?
Now we get into governance. So as I was saying, the reserves are basically federal lands. So the government has put in the place of a chief and council system that we operate on our reserves. Our chief and councils are our decision makers for our communities. But just what I was saying, when we talk to our communities, when we engage our people, we engage everyone. It's all inclusive. So when we bring in our elders provide that wisdom, their input into that engagement. Our elders cannot speak to or for our chief and councils on behalf of the nation, but because they're so respected and revered from our chief and councils, we include their input. But if you are working, say, from industry perspective, you deal with chief and councils, or like if there's a department like a IRC, Industry Relations Group, you deal with them because no one else is empowered to speak on behalf of the community except for the governance body, which is chief and council.
Thank you. So our next question here says, how as organizations can we support our Indigenous staff who are facing challenges related to things like intergenerational trauma?
Well, this comes back to your own company Indigenous programming or your Indigenous space where you want to be in this space. You could offer everything from a mentorship program to a cultural center. You could bring in elder support staff for your employees on a monthly basis, weekly basis, depending on your location. There are a lot of resources too, but it begins with asking yourself within your company, where do you want to be in that space? And for us at Eco Canada, we've got certain programs in place that support Indigenous employees like myself, but it also comes down to almost a retention aspect. What are you going to do to retain and support your employees? Are you going to offer Indigenous 101 employee education to all your staff, or is that going to be ongoing? Are you going to even have Indigenous event a month or a week where you could bring in outside resources to support these employees? Could you, as a company, do more events out in the community that would support that your Indigenous employees or those people that are having that challenge, that particular challenge? So it just brings different aspects, but there are definitely different things a company can be doing. And I could talk to you more specifically in detail offline here.
All right, and the next question here says, when celebrating and recognizing Indigenous culture, how do we make sure we don't step into the territory of cultural appropriation?
That's a great question. And this is where I would hope if you have other Indigenous employees that you would be engaging them for their wisdom on this, having their input into your company. Now, for myself, I keep things at a high level, general, very respectful level, and I don't go into I try not to get into that scenario. But if I do, then I would invite all those other communities that are close by to become part of, so that way you have their input into that space. And it's all collaborative effort. It's all working together and building that relationship. So.
And it comes back to what you were saying, Brad, nothing about us without us. And I think that's such a great phrase.
It really is. I wish I knew who said that or remember who said that, but it's so impactful.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to try plan something, well, include us. This is what, come out to us and just have that general conversation. This is what we're looking at doing. We would like your input, or we would like your thoughts on this. And if they like it, then have their input. Work together and collaborate. And that's going to build those meaningful relationships that will really bridge that path of reconciliation.
Okay, our next question here says, thank you for sharing with us, Brad. Do you have any suggestions for gifts of appreciation that would be appropriate for hosts and or elders?
So just what I do here, I'm sure that if you are industry, you're working within the Foreign Corruption Policy Act, you want to make sure whoever you are working with, they are appropriate gifts. When you're specifically talking elders, I always give, it's my practice that I always give one of those 4 sacred plants, something cultural that I know that they would use. I always put sweetgrass, tobacco, things like that. And then as far as giftings, make it meaningful. They don't just want trinkets from the company swag or whatever. Think how you would, what you would like, or what is appropriate for you if the roles were reversed. I tend to give practical gifts that vary in price. If I was to a chief and council, it would be like a possible Pendleton blanket or star quilt, like is behind me here. Things like that, that I know that they understand the meaning behind it. If it's for our elders particular, maybe anything from something for the house or something outside like camping gear, anything like that. But just make it sincere and relevant. Like you said, elders, I'm sure, aren't going to worry about getting a laser swag or a memory stick. So just make it, think about what you would want to make it respectful.
All right, our next question says, hello, Brad. I am an environmental science student and would like to learn about Indigenous land and people beyond my classroom setting. This is really important for me as I'm going to be working in and for Indigenous lands. What advice would you have for students like myself in terms of creating deeper awareness and connections with the culture and gaining more knowledge?
Interact. Go out to the local community that's closest to you. If you're not sure, go out to the closest Indigenous Friendship Center or Aboriginal Friendship Center, and they have elders out there. And engage those elders, engage those traditional knowledge keepers. Once you tie in, well, I'll speak to this in 3 parts. Well, the way I like to do in Indigenous teachings is 3 parts. One, through almost like this awareness, where it's an in-person session. The others could be like online trainings. But the third part that really solidifies it is that in-person, hands-on practical experiences. Excuse me. Those solidify those other 2. So you've heard me talk about it. Now you go out and see it and experience it for yourself firsthand. that's your teachings, that's your experiences. No one can take that away from you. And that's how things get embedded, ingrained into our culture, our way of life, because we spent those time with our parents, our grandparents that taught us those traditional ways of life, or how to live off of Mother Earth, how to respect Mother Earth. All those cultural, spiritual teachings that were passed down or taught to us are now ours. And I pass that on to my children, but they have to live it to experience it, to fully understand that teaching, that earning that teaching. So I encourage you, wherever you are at, to go out to your closest Indigenous community or Indigenous Friendship Center, form those relationships with some of those local elders or local community members, and try to engage and ask them to take you out in the land to share some of those teachings. So if you're in Calgary, please feel free to email me, give me a call afterwards, and I'll do what I can to support you on that there.
All right, thank you. The next question here says, are Indigenous people not free to move throughout the United States?
Well, they're free to move throughout the United States, but on reserve, we have complete control on reserve. We're Indigenous people. I'm adopted on Cheyenne, Rosebud, Pine Ridge. And when I'm down there, I am Lakota Sioux. The minute I step off, I lose all my Indigenous rights, and I become a United States citizen. That's what I meant. They have complete autonomy over what goes on in the reserve. And in the States, and this is what really brought this to light, when they were looking at doing the pipeline through there, everyone, I'm trying to think of the rock, Standing Rock.
Yeah.
When they were trying to build that pipeline through, they went through two corners of the reserves. There was no consultation, there was no engagement. And that's what came up from that, is that Standing Rock came up saying, no, this is our reserve land. You don't have say where a pipeline can go on the reserve, and this is why we blockaded you here. And now they had to move that pipeline over. They have complete autonomy on reserve as Indigenous people in the States. They have no rights once they take one step off. They become just like any other US citizen. Unlike in Canada, where we're allies with the Crown, our rights go beyond, our traditional lands go beyond, and we're in partnership with the government, or we're allies with the government, but yet in the States they're not. That's why I don't like using that word as a defeated race, but conquered race. It's just the outcome. That's how the United States have dealt with their Indigenous people and their policies.
All right, we have another question here that was asking where they can learn more about Indigenous culture and tradition. So hopefully Brad sort of answered that for you in the previous question that he answered. And we have another question.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I encourage everyone, wherever you're from, go to if there is a local Indigenous or Aboriginal Friendship Center, they're a fantastic resource as a starting point.
Perfect. So our next question here says, are non-Indigenous people welcome to be in reserve areas?
Good question. Yes, you are. But I would go through chief council or a community member, build that relationship and ask them would it be okay if I came out? Just do things in a respectful manner. And if you know someone, if you don't know someone, engage, call their band office and engage, saying, hey, look, would it be appropriate or would you welcome me coming on? And There are scenarios I know of. A perfect example is the Grey Eagle Hotel right here, Casino Hotel. I know we have a ring road going through there, exchange of 40 acres, et cetera, et cetera. But there are so many people cutting through now the reserve that our elders can't even sleep because there's so much traffic at 2, 3 in the morning.
Mm.
So I've had even our relations kind of stepping out as acting like a roadblock or just security. Who's coming on the reserve at 3 a.m.? Why is there 50 vehicles cutting through? So again, I would ask, make sure it's appropriate for you, or if you could have that permission appropriateness to come out to the reserve.
Right. The next question here says, you mentioned that the Métis are descendants of Indigenous women and European men. If I understand right, First Nation status could only be passed down to children from their father. Is that why Métis do not have status? Has there been any change for this community since the rule about women having to marry out of First Nation status has changed?
It hasn't changed yet, but there has been 2 bills, and this is where Bill C-31 comes in. So if I didn't have time to go into enfranchisement, but basically if a person went to war, if a person married another non-Indigenous person, they would lose their status. And the one thing that has changed are the 2 bills, Bill C-31, which basically acknowledges the first generation off. So my mother married a non-Indigenous person. She lost her rights through Bill C-31. We got our rights back through our grandfather's reserve. So that's why I say I'm from Saddle Lake. My mother's Saddle Lake. But our future generations, I married Blackfoot, another Indigenous person. So our children's remaining status, my sisters, my nieces, they are non-status because they have not married into Indigenous people. So unfortunately, things have not changed that way yet.
All right, and then this looks like the last question we have here, and it says, when speaking with Indigenous peoples, is it appropriate to refer to plants and animals as being native, or is it best to use the term Indigenous?
If you use it from the context of being born from, like you're native to this region, then it would be okay to use the word native. If it's out of context and just saying, hey, this thing, I would really refrain from using it. But when you're talking native species, native habitat, I find it would be okay. And I know all of my colleagues that worked in the environmental department still utilizing the term native when we're talking to species and habitat. So as long as it's in that born from content, I'm sure it's fine.
All right, perfect. Yeah, that was the last question that we had submitted there.
Great. Thank you so much, Laurel, and thank you, Brad. Again, lots of great questions there. I think we got through them all, but Brad's contact details are here, or you can reach out to me at events@eco.ca if you have more questions that you would like to ask. And there's a couple of questions in the chat box just about the upcoming webinars and how people can sign up. We're just setting up those registration pages right now. Once we have that link ready, we will send it to everyone who registered for this webinar to make sure you can get the next installment. So October 28th and then November 18th, we're going to have 2 more webinars where Brad can go into a little bit more detail about specific aspects. I want to just thank everybody for dialing in today. It's been a really great session. I think, as Brad mentioned, there's so much detail we could go into in Indigenous awareness. We wanted to provide a high-level overview, but if you do have comments or suggestions, you want to see more detail about particular topics, please use the survey to let us know. And you can visit our website, eco.ca, to find out more about what we're doing or sign up for our newsletter. But thank you again, Brad. It's been such a wonderful presentation, and thanks to everybody for dialing in.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.